The flight deck of a guided missile destroyer is not large. By naval aviation standards, it is barely adequate. A steel rectangle, approximately 18 meters wide and 12 meters long, positioned at the ship's stern, designed to accommodate a single helicopter of the MH-60R class, with margins that experienced aviation crews describe as workable and novice crews describe as terrifying. To land on it requires the pilot to manage not just the approach geometry, but the ship's motion, the pitch, roll, and yaw of a 9,200-ton hull moving through open ocean, while simultaneously monitoring rotor clearance from the hangar door, the deck edge, and the safety netting on both sides. The margin between a successful landing and a rotor strike event is measured in feet and in the precision of training that makes those feet feel sufficient. To prevent a helicopter from landing on that deck requires far less precision. A helicopter hovering at 100 feet directly above the deck, its rotor wash forcing any approaching aircraft into an uncontrolled aerodynamic environment, occupies the flight deck not by touching it, but by making it unusable. The physics are straightforward. The tactical application of those physics, placing a foreign military helicopter at 100 feet over a U.S. destroyer's flight deck, while surface assets close from 3 bearings, was something the People's Liberation Army Navy had been developing with the methodical patience that characterized its approach to every gray zone capability. In the Philippine Sea, 340 nautical miles east of the Luzon Strait, the geometry had been assembling since 7:04 a.m. The guided missile destroyer was operating on a standard Pacific patrol track, northbound at 14 knots, no specific transit objective in the immediate sense, a presence patrol, the category of operation that the U.S. 7th Fleet maintained continuously across the Philippine Sea to establish and sustain the pattern of lawful naval activity in international waters that the plan's expanding presence was designed to complicate. The Philippine Sea was not the South China Sea. It did not carry the specific territorial framing that Scarborough Shoal or the Paracel Islands produced. It was open ocean, water over which no nation claimed jurisdiction, through which any navy had the right to operate. The plan operated in it anyway, increasingly, and with the specific character of a navy that had decided that the Philippine Sea, adjacent to China's first island chain, was strategic space that required active contestation regardless of what international law said about it. At 7:04 a.m., the CIC reported 3 surface contacts on the western horizon, bearing 285 degrees, ranges between 18 and 23 nautical miles, all classified as planned within 4 minutes of initial acquisition. 1 Type 05, 2 D destroyer, 1 Type 05, 4A frigate, 1 auxiliary support vessel of a type the intelligence library classified as having replenishment and electronic intelligence functions. All 3 contacts had been on their current courses since before the destroyer's CIC began tracking them. They had been there before the watch, positioned and waiting with the patience of a formation that had arrived before its subject, 2,800 yards at 18 knots. A surface formation approached from the west, with the Type 05-2D as the lead element and the Type 05-4A, and auxiliary, positioned in a trailing formation that placed them in supporting geometry. Standard planned surface pressure approach, the kind of 3-ship formation that the Scarborough encounters had established as a documented tactic. The CIC crew recognized the geometry. The captain recognized the geometry. What neither of them had fully accounted for at 7:04 a.m. was the air component. At 7:11 a.m., the EW operator reported 2 aerial contacts at bearing 280 degrees, range 14 nautical miles, altitude 600 feet, speed 140 knots. Fixed heading toward the destroyer. Classification: rotary wing, probable Z-9 naval helicopter, the planned standard shipboard helicopter, launched from one of the approaching surface contacts at a range that placed it beyond the surface formation's own visual horizon, moving at the speed of a helicopter in transit rather than a helicopter in patrol. 2 Z-9s, 140 knots. Inbound, quote 2, quote 3. Over. Not alongside. Not at 200 yards off the beam. The Z-9s were not approaching to parallel the destroyer. They were approaching to fly over it, specifically over the aft section of the hull where the flight deck was located. The Seahawk was on the flight deck, not airborne. On deck, in the hangar, its crew in the ready room, completing their pre-brief for a scheduled patrol launch at 7:30 a.m. The launch had been planned as a routine patrol sortie, the kind the destroyer's aviation detachment flew twice per day on standard Pacific operations. The plan had been made before the planned surface contacts appeared at 7:04 a.m. and before the 2 Z-9s appeared at 7:11 a.m. At 7:14 a.m., the captain issued 2 simultaneous orders. Get the Seahawk crew to the aircraft. Immediate launch preparation. I want that helicopter in the air before those Z-9s reach overhead. And FLIR on both aerial contacts. Continuous documentation. Track their approach geometry. The Seahawk crew had been in the ready room at pre-brief. Alert 5 status. 5 minutes to launch under standard parameters. In actual execution, with the crew running to the aircraft and the deck crew already responding to the visual alert signal from the bridge, the timeline compressed, rotors turning at 7:16 a.m., clearance to launch requested at 7:17 a.m. The Z-9s reached overhead at 7:18 a.m. The first Z-9 established a hover at 120 feet directly above the flight deck at 7:18 a.m., its rotor system generating a downwash that the Seahawk's flight crew, still in the aircraft on deck, felt immediately as a turbulent air mass pressing down on their aircraft. A helicopter at 120 feet overhead in hover produces a rotor wash column that descends to the surface with sufficient velocity to create a 40 to 60 knot airflow on anything directly below. For a helicopter attempting to lift from that surface, 40 to 60 knots of turbulent downwash arriving from directly overhead was not a manageable aerodynamic environment. It was an environment in which the lifting rotor could not develop the consistent pressure differential between its upper and lower surfaces that produced controlled lift, creating instead a series of violent aerodynamic fluctuations that would make any departure from the deck unpredictable and potentially not survivable. The Seahawk could not launch, while the Z-9 was at 120 feet overhead. Quote 6. The aviation safety officer reported to the bridge. Quote 7. The second Z-9 did not hover over the flight deck. It established a racetrack orbit at 200 feet altitude over the destroyer's overall position. A wider pattern that placed it alternately to port and starboard of the hull, maintaining a continuous presence above the ship without the extreme downwash event of the hovering Z9, but contributing to the overall disrupted air environment above the ship. One Z9 at 120 feet over the flight deck, one Z9 at 200 feet in orbit, the Seahawk grounded. The surface formation was still approaching. The Type 052D's CPA was now 16 minutes away. The cost of the flight deck being blocked was specific and layered. A Seahawk airborne provided the destroyer with a significant tactical multiplier, extended surface radar coverage, identification capability at range, LRAD, and laser designator options against approaching surface contacts, and the psychological and tactical effect on approaching planned formations that a helicopter overhead consistently produced. A grounded Seahawk was a ship operating with one less sensor layer, one less escalation option, and one less deterrent signal available at the moment. A three-ship plan formation was inside 20 minutes to closest approach. The plan had designed the Z9 positioning to create precisely this gap. The surface formation would arrive at close range with the U.S. ship's primary rotary wing asset on the deck rather than in the air. The defensive geometry compressed by the removal of its most flexible element. The captain stood at the bridge window and assessed the picture in its full complexity. Three planned surface contacts approaching from bearing 285 CPA inside 17 minutes, one Z9 at 120 feet over the flight deck, rendering it unusable. One Z9 in orbit at 200 feet. The Seahawk grounded, and the documentation clock running on all of it. He did not speak for 9 seconds. Then, what's the Z9's fuel state? The CIC tactical officer understood the question immediately. A planned Z9 operating from a surface contact at 23 nautical miles carried a fuel load that, at hover power settings, supported a specific duration on station. Hover consumes significantly more fuel than transit or patrol flight. A Z9 at 120 feet in sustained hover over a destroyer's flight deck was burning fuel at a rate that imposed a natural time limit on the blockade, quote 940 to 60 minutes. The planned surface contact's CPA was 17 minutes away. The surface geometry would resolve one way or another before the Z9's fuel state became the determining factor. But the fuel clock was real. The first friction arrived at 7:22 a.m. from the ship's own aviation systems. The flight deck officer reported that the sustained rotor wash from the Z9 at 120 feet had elevated the deck's wind environment above the deck crew's safety threshold for personnel operating in the open. 2 deck crew members who had been on the flight deck in final launch preparation positions for the Seahawk were required, under aviation safety regulations, to move to covered positions when sustained wind speeds on deck exceeded 45 knots. The Z9's downwash was producing 52 knots of sustained airflow on the deck's aft section. The deck crew moved. The Seahawk's launch preparation was now unmanned. The aircraft was ready to fly, its rotors were turning, its crew was strapped in and prepared, but the external pre-launch checks that required deck personnel to physically verify rotor blade clearance and deck condition could not be completed with the deck crew sheltering. Not a mechanical failure, a regulatory one. The aviation safety framework that protected the deck crew made the Seahawk's launch contingent on conditions that the Z9 was preventing from being met. The captain received the report. He filed it in the documentation record. He did not alter his assessment of the situation. FLAR on both Z9s, continuous. I want every minute of their position, altitude, and behavior on record. At 7:24 a.m., the surface situation updated. Type 052D, CPA, revised, 2,100 yards. Lead contact has increased speed to 22 knots. Type 054A, following at 1,400 yards astern. Auxiliary holding position at 18 nautical miles, not approaching. 2,100 yards for the Type 052D in 13 minutes. The planned destroyer was accelerating its approach while the Z9 held the flight deck blocked. The surface and air components were coordinating. The Z9's blockade was not an independent provocation. It was the preparatory element of a surface approach designed to be executed with the U.S. ship's aviation asset grounded. At 7:26 a.m., the captain made his first active response. Increase speed to 20 knots. Come right 15 degrees. New course 015. The speed and course change served two purposes simultaneously. The course changed to 015 degrees, slightly east of north. Moved the ship's heading relative to the Z9 hovering over the flight deck. A Z9 in hover directly over a moving ship's flight deck needed to maintain its position relative to the ship's movement to sustain the blockade geometry. A ship that increased speed and altered course created a constantly shifting hover target. The Z9 needed to translate its hover position to remain over the flight deck, consuming additional fuel and requiring the Z9 pilot to manage the transition from static hover to a moving reference hover, a significantly more demanding aerodynamic task. The 20-knot speed increase produced an immediate deck wind effect as well. The ship's own forward motion added 6 knots of headwind to the deck environment, reducing the Z9's downwash contribution to the total deck wind. The deck wind at 20 knots, ship speed, with the relative wind from the ship's motion partially counteracting the Z9's downwash, dropped from 52 knots to approximately 43 knots, below the 45-knot threshold that had required the deck crew to shelter. The deck crew moved back. The external pre-launch checks resumed. The Z9 at 120 feet was now required to translate its hover position continuously as the ship moved at 20 knots on the new heading. Moving reference hover demanded pilot attention that static hover did not. The Z9 crew was now managing both altitude hold and lateral position relative to a ship whose deck was moving beneath them. The hover stability that the blockade geometry required was degrading in real time. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 14, underscore, underscore. The Z9 had climbed 20 feet, not retreat, an altitude adjustment made by a pilot managing an increasingly demanding hover environment. At 140 feet rather than 120 feet, the rotor wash at deck level was attenuated by distance, the same physical output spread over a larger area by the additional 20 feet of vertical travel. The deck wind from the Z9's downwash dropped further. The second friction arrived at 7:29 a.m. from the communication circuit. Fifth Fleet Command had been monitoring since 7:14 a.m. The priority message asked the commanding officer to assess whether the Z-9's flight deck hover constituted a violation of the Convention on International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea in its application to aircraft, which required aircraft to avoid creating hazards for vessels below them. Fifth Fleet was preparing a formal protest through naval channels and needed the commanding officer's assessment of whether the Z-9's behavior met the threshold for characterization as an unsafe and unprofessional aerial encounter per the established U.S.-China protocols for such incidents. The message required a response. The captain drafted it in 30 seconds. Z-9 at 140 feet over flight deck, sustained hover, deck wind elevated above crew safety threshold until speed adjustment. Seahawk launch suspended due to rotor wash interference. CPA to surface contacts, now 11 minutes. Assessment. Z-9 behavior is consistent with intentional flight deck blockade tactic, meets threshold for unsafe and unprofessional characterization. Request formal protest through established channels. Continuing response. At 7:31 a.m., the external launch checks were complete. The deck crew was clear of the flight deck. The Seahawk's rotors were at flight RPM. Seahawk launch, the captain said. Do not wait for the Z-9 to clear. Launch now. The aviation safety officer's assessment of the launch environment. Z-9 now at 145 feet overhead. Rotor wash at deck level attenuated to approximately 35 knots by the ship's speed and the Z-9's altitude increase. 35 knots was within the Seahawk's launch envelope, demanding at the higher end of acceptable, requiring the pilot to account for the turbulent layer above the deck, but physically manageable by a trained crew. The Seahawk lifted from the deck at 7:32 a.m. The departure was not smooth. The turbulent air in the 0 to 200-foot altitude band above the flight deck, a volume of atmosphere disturbed by the Z-9's rotor system, the ship's forward motion at 20 knots, and the interaction between those two effects produced a series of aerodynamic inputs that the Seahawk's crew managed with the precision of aviators who had spent years working in the specific aerodynamic environment of shipboard operations. The aircraft climbed through the disturbed layer and emerged above 200 feet into clear air. The Seahawk was airborne. The Z-9 at 145 feet altitude was now no longer blocking a grounded helicopter. It was at 145 feet below an airborne Seahawk that had climbed through its downwash and was now above it. The tactical geometry had inverted. The Z-9 had been positioned to block a helicopter from getting into the air. The helicopter was in the air. The Z-9 was underneath it. The Seahawk's pilot reported the geometry to the ship. On deck at 220 feet. Z-9 is below us at approximately 145 feet. Z-9 is beginning to climb. The Z-9 was climbing. The pilot's response to the unexpected geometry of a U.S. helicopter now above his aircraft. The Z-9 climbed from 145 feet to 200 feet, then 250 feet. The climbing Z-9 was no longer in hover and was no longer maintaining its blockade position over the flight deck. Its departure from the hover position released the flight deck from the downwash environment and began a repositioning that was not the Z-9's intended next phase. The orbiting Z-9, the one at 200 feet in the racetrack pattern, altered its orbit at 7:33 a.m. in response to the Seahawk's presence. The orbit shifted outward, the Z9 increasing the radius of its racetrack to maintain distance from the airborne Seahawk. A racetrack orbit that increased its radius to avoid another aircraft was a racetrack orbit that was no longer performing its intended function of maintaining continuous presence above the destroyer. At 7:34 a.m., the captain addressed the surface picture. Quote, 1-8. The Seahawk banked west and accelerated toward the approaching planned destroyer. The Type 052D was now at 1,600 yards and closing. Inside the range at which its crew could read individual features on the destroyer's superstructure without optical assistance. The Seahawk's arrival overhead at 7:36 a.m., its FLIR locked on the planned destroyer's deck and superstructure, its laser designator available but not yet activated, produced a visible response in the CIC. The Type 052D reduced speed from 22 knots to 16 knots over the following 90 seconds. Type 052DD decelerating. Speed now 16 knots. CPA revised, 1,400 yards. Closing, but slower. The Type 054A trailing the 052D also reduced speed. The surface formation's approach was not halted. The CPA was still decreasing, but the rate of closure had been reduced. The Seahawk's presence overhead, which had not existed 40 minutes earlier when the Z9 had positioned to prevent it, was producing the effect on the surface formation that its absence had been designed to eliminate. At 7:39 a.m., the Z9 that had climbed from the hover position completed a wide circle and began heading west, bearing 285 degrees toward the Type 052D, returning to its launch platform. Z9 Alpha departing. Course 285. Speed 130 knots, returning to surface contact. The orbiting Z9 continued its pattern for another 4 minutes, then also turned west. Z9 Bravo, departing. Course 285. Both Z9s were withdrawing. The Type 052D was at 1,100 yards, still approaching, but at 16 knots rather than 22 knots, and with the Seahawk overhead rather than grounded. At 7:44 a.m., the CIWS entered passive thermal tracking mode on the Type 052D. The barrel rotated, its sensor suite locking onto the approaching planned destroyer's hull and superstructure with the precision that passive thermal tracking provided. Not engaged. Tracking. The signal that the CIWS rotation sent was the same signal it always sent in these encounters. We have the measurement on you that matters. At 7:46 a.m., the Type 052D reached its CPA, 1,100 yards. The contact held its position at 1,100 yards for approximately 3 minutes, matching the destroyer's course and speed, a brief shoulder position that the surface approach had been building toward, and then began to fall back as the destroyer maintained 20 knots and the planned destroyer held at 16 knots. Type 052 DCPA passed. Contact bearing aft. Range now 1,200 yards and opening. The Type 054A had not closed within 2,000 yards at any point during the engagement. The auxiliary had remained at 18 nautical miles throughout. At 7:51 a.m., the Seahawk returned to the flight deck. The helmsman, who had held the adjusted course of 015 degrees at 20 knots from 7:26 a.m. through the Z9 hover, through the Seahawk's departure, through the Type 052D's CPA and withdrawal, 32 minutes on the adjusted course, completed his watch rotation at 8 a.m. His relief took the wheel. The outgoing helmsman walked aft without ceremony and stood for a moment at the hatch to the exterior passageway, his hand on the door handle. Looking at nothing visible through the metal of the door, he stood there for 6 seconds. He opened the door and went out into the Philippine Sea morning. The open ocean, the light chop, the western horizon empty now of planned surface contacts, and took a breath of air that was not recycled and not filtered and not carrying the ambient electronic smell of a CIC running at continuous contact status. He took that breath. He went back inside. At 8:09 a.m., the situation report reached 7th Fleet Command. 3 planned surface contacts approached from bearing 285, Type 052D, Type 054A, and auxiliary. 2 Z-9 helicopters conducted a coordinated flight deck blockade operation, one in sustained hover at 120 to 145 feet over the flight deck, one in racetrack orbit at 200 feet. Seahawk launch suspended for 14 minutes due to rotor wash interference. Response: speed increased to 20 knots. Course adjusted 15 degrees to starboard, reducing Z-9 downwash at deck level below cruise safety threshold. Seahawk launched through the turbulent layer at 7:32 a.m. Z-9 hover position released following Seahawk launch. Both Z-9s withdrew at 7:39 and 7:43 a.m. Type 052, DCPA 1,100 yards at 7:46 a.m. Now opening. Transit continuing. 2 planned Z-9 helicopters. 14 minutes of flight deck blockade. 3 planned surface contacts. 42 minutes from first Z-9 arrival overhead to Type 05, 2 DCPA passage. 120 feet. Minimum Z-9 hover altitude over flight deck. 1,100 yards. Type 052D closest approach. 0 Seahawk launches prevented past the 14-minute window. 0 course deviations beyond the tactical heading adjustment. 0 surface contacts within 1,000 yards. The flight deck is 18 meters wide and 12 meters long. At 120 feet above it, a hover can make it feel much smaller. What it cannot do is make it unusable permanently. Not if the ship moves, and not if the crew on the deck and in the aircraft understands that unusable is a condition, not a verdict, and that conditions change when the geometry that created them is removed by the people being pressured rather than the people applying the pressure. The Seahawk launched. That was the entirety of the response. It was enough.